So, hello everybody. Um, my name's Andy, and what's been really interesting listening to Paul and Rachel has been a number of those kinds of threads that sort of perhaps resonate a little bit with what I'm going to talk about. One of the problems I have is I've produced a PowerPoint with all my notes on in the section underneath the PowerPoint, and then when you play with Zoom and PowerPoint, you realize then you can only see the big screen. You can't see your notes underneath. So this will be winging it as opposed to me looking at what I've already written, which is kind of nice anyway. I don't mind that anyway. But there's some really nice themes that come up from listening to Paul talk about dogs, journeys, and writing. And Rachel thinking about being off the beaten track and that sort of digging around in your own mind and thinking about journeys, because I've got quite a few sort of similar sort of themes. I've tried to stick to the sort of brief of thinking about roots and the roots in my work and the sorts of philosophical, the sorts of understandings and the sorts of things that lead to what I do. So let's see what I can do. I'm going to talk a little bit about the most recent things that I've been doing, the most recent body of work. But let's just start from the beginning. So I'm a visual artist, and so I make. I'm very interested as an artist in meaning making. That's kind of key to what I do. But I'm also a researcher, and I'm interested in inquiring, which kind of makes sense as an artist. I'm interested in the way that I can use the visual and I can use art to inquire about all sorts of things that are important to me. And I'm a teacher. So I work in a university and I teach postgrads, and my teaching is about dialogue. It's about collaboration. It's about co-construction of knowledge and understanding and meanings. So in many respects, all of those different elements just mean I'm an artist, because all of the elements of what I do as an artist work in terms of the other aspects. They're synergized within the sorts of things I kind of do anyway. So I'm just going to talk about the most recent. I use the most recent thing that I've done as the sort of focus, but I have to kind of lead up to a little bit. I'm sort of thinking in a rhizomatic way. So I'm thinking about all these roots that all disappear in a three-dimensional way around. And I'm trying to pick a strand that leads to text, because that was the brief, that I've got to talk about text. There's many strands in my work and many different aspects of it that that are important, that are about dislocation, they're about depression, they're about dyslexia, they're about the brain, they're about embodiment, they're about, it just keeps going. There's lots of different things. So I'm just going to pick out the bit that's about knowing and knowledge, and the strand that's about text, and just link it a little bit to the recent exhibition that I had in Japan, where I was invited to do a residency, and I used my own practice, my own work, as the basis of the conversation and the dialogue in the residency, working with some international artist students from Japan, but also from across the globe. I'm going to use that sort of the art of walking, which was the sort of more recent body of work, as a way of being unpacking some of those things that are about text. Now, as a dyslexic, I've historically not really been that keen to write or to really think about text as a part of my work. But I think over time, I've come to terms with thinking about the sort of relationship between me and text, and me and making and my own artwork, through a sort of a journey that I went on a few years ago, when I was starting to think about my own brain and diversity within brains, and the difference in brains and the different ways of thinking. And because obviously being dyslexic, your brain is wired slightly differently to everybody else, you kind of interact and you make connections in a way that's slightly not normal in some ways. I have to be careful about using terms like normal, but you certainly make different connections. You certainly make different sort of understandings. And I started to engage with those understandings with my alter ego. I have an alter ego as a scientist, and I play a role, a different role as a scientist. And so I've collaborated. One of the nice things about my role is I can collaborate with others, and I've collaborated with poets, I've collaborated with neuroscientists and scientists, and that collaboration helps me with understanding the different usage of language, the different readings of things, situations, knowledge is really quite important when you come at it from these very different sort of perspectives. And for me, part of the importance of collaboration is getting to understand those different usage of language, their different understandings of language, as well as their different disciplines and approaches. So I did some work, maybe started about 2015, working with a neuroscientist at Sussex University, looking at the brain. So what you have here is an actual replica of my brain, cold cast resin, clear resin, and one in clear and one in aluminium. You have drawings of different parts of my body, because I'm thinking about that sort of embodiment, the different ways of knowing, the different ways that I understand information, not just as a cerebral activity, not just in my brain, but in terms of how it's embodied in my gut, in my lungs, in my heart, and in my soul. So I'm kind of playing and thinking very much about how I come to terms with and how I understand and how I make sense of the world. And so these kind of lovely jackets, the lab coats that I sort of made, I would wear and I would act out and perform as some sort of kind of mad scientist, I suppose. But I also, as I mentioned, I in collaborating with the neuroscientists at Sussex, I went and had my brain scanned. So this is the inside of my head. I was very interested in what was going on in my head, what is happening in my head, how my head works, which bits work, which bits don't work. And so I produced a whole series of work that was about being inside my head, being a part of a sort of, diverse, a different brain. And this was really kind of, an integral part of mapping out different parts of my brain, working out where different things connect, where they don't connect, how language and vision and empathy, for instance. So one of the things I was looking at was the interesting aspect of empathy. I was invited to Helsinki. This may play. Let me know if this plays. Does this play? Yeah, it does play. Okay. So this is literally a stitching together of thousands of photographs that were taken of the inside of my head. So an MRI is a series of individual stills. And so what I did is painstakingly stitch them all together to make a little animation of being inside my head. And so you can fly through my brain from the sort of top to bottom, the left to right, and front to back. And I sort of based the whole series of work on this and discussions on this with neuroscientists, sort of trying to get inside my head, trying to sort of make sense of how it feels to have a brain. We've all got one. Well, I hope we've all got one, but we don't really think about it that much. And whilst I can feel my lungs working, I can't actually feel my brain working. So I was kind of interested in thinking about which bits don't work and why they're not working, and which bits are working, and what that might look like, and how they're interrelated and interconnected. So this was a kind of this was a part of an installation that I did with this piece playing. And I also did some recordings, I can't remember the term now. What's it called? Basically, I recorded my brain waves. I sort of turned my brainwave patterns into an audio and created a sound of me thinking. So as I had a thought, as it entered into my eyes and went through to my brain and connected, there's an electrical pulse that you can detect in your own brain, in your own electricity, that makes a very, very faint sound. And you can pick this up, you can record this, and you can amplify it. So over the top of this brain sort of map scan thing that I made, I also played the noise of me thinking. Now, it's really irritating. I'm not going to play the noise. It's like a series of high-pitched sort of crackling noises. So I won't. And I played this continually in a space. I had an exhibition at King's College, Cambridge, for a term as an artist in residence, and I played this every day for the term, and it kind of drove me a bit mad being in the room sort of listening to it. So I don't play it now because I can't stand the noise of my brain working. Yeah, so as I said, I was thinking about that relationship, those dialogues, those conversations, and those differences to then help make sense. I was also sort of thinking about the way that this affects my making. I'm interested in then the production of outcomes. As a visual artist, what can I sort of do in terms of the way that I'm encountering my brain, how it's shaping my understanding and the different processes that take place, whether it's my memories, whether it's about myself, whether it's about the collective understanding culturally and how these things develop, or how these things die as well. I'm interested in the idea of the outside stimulus infecting the inside, so the relationship to myself between the inner and the outer, and the way that these kind of intertwine, and how these experiences feed into thinking, and feed into experience, and feed into understanding. So all of that kind of artful inquiry, my dyslexia, the depression, the thinking about difference, thinking about engaging in conversations, sort of led to this sort of series of work. And as I said, I got to meet Charles Darwin and got to work with him on one occasion, which was really rather lovely, when I was sort of thinking about those kind of changes over time. I've got to sort of work. This is Anil Seth, one of the sort of professors of neuroscience, who I was kind of drawing on his head. You see, he's wearing a cap, and so I made this cap, a brain cap, where I drew different parts of the brain and where things were happening. And so we had a conversation, and while we're having a conversation, you could sort of think about what we were doing in our heads. You kind of brought the outside and made it sort of evident, and so then you kind of have more of a sort of an understanding of what's kind of happening, in terms of your thinking and your understanding. What else did I do? What else do I want to show you? Yeah, so this kind of leads up to then this sort of point about text. So I'm about halfway through, that's roughly right. So how did I get to this point where I started using text? So one of the strands for me of using text was starting to, I suppose, think like a scientist, and think like think in a slightly different way, and how I can kind of make more explicit the relationships that are happening, how I can sort of think about that sort of experience of talking and presenting and showing that makes sense in a visual way. And so I came to sort of thinking about this. I did some work in India, and I was really kind of intrigued by the way that public, governmental, as well as schools use text and image to sort of broadcast messages and information, public safety, etc., etc. And there was these really amazing, sort of almost like Victorian kind of posters where text and image were sort of used. And it's got me thinking, got me sort of working on that sort of aspect. And the exhibition that was here, that was in Aalto, which is in Finland, was a call for artists to respond to the idea of the diaspora across the world, the way countries are dealing with immigration, the way that some of them are clearly not dealing with immigration. And so Finland was really interesting because it's a pretty monoculture that was having to deal more with the idea of people coming to want to live there. So I was kind of interested in, well, how, what sort of qualities does one need to be able to engage with these kinds of differences? And I kind of started to identify, well, where is empathy? Empathy is key here in terms of how we live our lives and relate to others and make sense of these kinds of things. And so I was kind of plotting where empathy lives, or where there may be blind spots, like Rishi, who might have a big black blind spot in his empathy area, for instance. And so it's a really interesting conversation with with politicians and sort of cultural workers in Finland, thinking about their social issues, thinking about how artists can respond and think about those kind of developments. But that was where I kind of started writing on my work. That was where the first time of using text, and it was a little bit illustrative, but it was also quite exploratory. It was slightly imaginative. It was slightly sort of going towards kind of, sort of pushing more creatively rather than it being descriptive. I quite often lied, quite often made things up, quite often would use humor in these kinds of uses of text with the drawings. It kind of sort of was the start point for me thinking about those kinds of relationships. Okay, I'll keep moving because it's at the time. So that led me to this phase, which I just mentioned right at the beginning, of the art of walking, the phase where I started to sort of go out into the South Downs and started to walk on my own, started to think about very much about that relationship between me, my reflecting, my thinking, the space, my senses, my way of engaging with space and time and places, and how intensely that's a kind of an embodied and bodily kind of action. So I started writing as I was walking. I started to draw and write and map. I'm not too keen on the word mapping because that's sort of kind of talks about getting from A to B, where I tend to wander, as my brain tends to wander and meander, and it's not a kind of a linear sort of trajectory, which is rather great on some occasions and be quite frustrating on other occasions. So I started sort of thinking about where I was going, and I started making little notes and references to places that I've been, and as I kind of take them back to this, I would take them back to the studio, take my notes, take my sort of thoughts. I would then plot on sometimes on maps where I'd been, and I would start to sort of think about how I was feeling or reacting to some of those spaces and reacting to some of those kinds of understanding. So very much kind of a local environment, which was really kind of interesting for me, very much kind of thinking about the South Downs, and a lot of the places that I have walked pretty much the entire length now of the South Downs, from Winchester to Eastbourne. And so they're kind of sort of different understandings of time. They're different understandings of speed and distance, and my relationship as a body moving through these spaces and on these well-beaten paths and off these paths, and clearly this one sort of getting stuck on the path a little bit, kind of walking into a bog and thinking about what that as an action and is like, and how that refers also to sort of metaphorically to other kind of things. And so a lot of these are starting to edge along the lines of almost like you could be like haikus. They could be the start of a little poem, but they get broken up because as a dyslexic you get so far and then you just you only see things in fragments. You don't see things necessarily in a nice fluid way when you tend to write. So a lot of these things tend to be also including mistakes. I make a lot of mistakes when I write, which I think is quite funny. I misunderstand things. So I use a lot of what are called homophones, which are like double meanings. So the meaning of a word sounds the same but has two different spellings and has two different meanings. So soul, as in your boot on the base of, and soul as in inside. So I play a lot with those kinds of double meanings and play a lot with words, and that's quite, you know, sort of deliberate and important in some of these playings.
Andy, I'm gonna give you a bit of a nudge.
Yeah, nod. Okay, fine. I'm winding up. So this last one is very much where I've been using text wholeheartedly, sort of plotting, using, relating to the walking, to the thinking, to these sorts of experiences. And these are kind of used in installations. They've used with objects. They're used to create environments and to sort of think about those sort of relationships. So yeah, I'll stop there. That's makes sense if that's okay with you. But I'd really intrigued by some of the relationships. I have a dog. It's called the black dog. It's been with me for about 15 to 20 years. Some days it sits and nips at my ankles. Sometimes it disappears. Sometimes it sits on my chest and I can't get up in the day because he's just too bloody heavy. So I've used the black dog as a really nice metaphor constantly throughout the sort of work, and it goes everywhere, and it has an impact and effect. Depends on you know, how it's feeling on that day.